That's on the other hand, I recognize any number of people here who I know are not lawyers, but I would be loath to call them normal. So that's another false dichotomy, another phrase I learned at Dartmouth. Any of you judges? Nah, I persuaded Jack said with nothing.
Jack is not here, right?
He is here.
Oh, yeah.
No, but he's not here in the room. He was going to come until I started talking with him. Well, before we get started, I'm an old school teacher, so I'm very accustomed to being interrupted and abused in all sorts of other ways. So if you have questions as I go along, you know, we're supposed to reserve 15 minutes at the end, customary thing. But if you have questions to go along, feel free to raise your hand.
I'll make you feel home.
How you make me feel at home?
Isn't that what kids do?
Not my kids, Sam. We're in this backwards baseball cast. Yeah, I mean, and particularly at our age, you know, by the time we get to the end of the presentation, you probably may have forgotten the question you're going to ask anyhow. So. Well, back in November of 1986, I had the good fortune of being chosen as Chief Justice. William Rehnquist, Chief of Staff. Now, the official title to that today is called Counselor to the Chief Justice. Isn't that a very impressive sound, I think? Well, talk about title inflation. Back when I took the job, it was called Administrative Assistant to the Chief Justice. Both of these by statute, by the way. But as probably we all know now, the title Administrative Assistant means you're a secretary. And I once had a secretary, subsequent years, who hated to be called a secretary. And, you know, and I said, look, Condoleezza Rice isn't bothered by this. Hillary Clinton isn't bothered by this. What's your problem? She also said that she worked with Bob Reich, not when he became Secretary of Labor, but when he was in the Commerce Department. And I said, geez, you know, I may see Bob next college reunion or so, I'll ask if he remembers you. And she had great political insight. She said, well, even if he doesn't, he'll tell you he does. Back to the presentation. The best way to understand what my job entailed is to look at the job of the Chief Justice in his capacity as Chief Justice of the United States. He has two titles. One is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, and that refers to all his casework, handling cases. The other title is simply Chief Justice of the United States, and that refers to his role as the Chief Executive Officer of the United States government. And, you know, I mean, it's comparable in some sense to as the President of the Executive Branch, or maybe the Speaker of the House in the Legislative Branch, the first branch. But more specifically, and he has a lot of roles, It's a big job. And more specifically, he's chairman of the Judicial Conference of the United States. He's chairman of the board of the Federal Judicial Center. He oversees the director of the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. He's the chancellor of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian. He's the honorary chairman of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and he appoints and oversees the Supreme Court Fellows Commission. In addition, as the Chief Judicial Officer of the United States, he deals not only with federal judges, but with state judges and other officials and foreign government representatives, members of Congress, members of the executive branch, on matters, of course, that do not involve cases. He's also asked often to speak at law schools and universities and colleges. When I was there, he was asked to speak here at Dartmouth. And then there's this correspondence from the general public, and which is, you know, unbelievable in some respects. You know, you get these letters, you know, dear Chief Justice, make my father walk again, you know. It's like, that's a slight exaggeration, but not too much, not too much. Now, I'll talk about all this stuff in due course, but you're probably asking yourself, well, what's this have to do with the title of this presentation? And, well, he's obviously also responsible for running the Supreme Court building and everybody who works in it. This takes us back to 1969, the year after we graduated, the year of Dartmouth's bicentennial. But believe it or not, something actually more important happened that year in addition to the moon landing. And that was the year that Earl Warren retired as Chief Justice and was replaced by Warren Earl Burger, which was a matter of some amusement at the time, apparently. Well, when Chief Justice Burger took the job, he saw all these things, and he not only saw them, but eventually he experienced them. And he realized that he needed help in addition to the secretarial staff that he had. Chief Justice has 3 secretaries, and the associates have 2. They're entitled to 4 law clerks. Many of them have only 3, and Rehnquist had only 3. And even retired justices can have 1 secretary and 1 law clerk. So anyhow, Chief Justice Berger said, look, we've got to do something to this, and he had this position created, and as I mentioned, by Congress. He initially thought that he would want to have a federal judge do this type of thing, and it would be called Chancellor of the Supreme Court. You see, you have the Chief Justice and then you have the Chancellor, and it's kind of like you know, that brief period of time when Ronald Reagan was thinking about Jerry Ford as co-president. Remember that? Well, that didn't fly. None of this stuff flew. And Jack Sedgwick is in here, that he lost his opportunity to become chancellor. You know, so they settled for us lower level types as the administrative assistant. Back to the Supreme Court building itself. Why does it have 500 employees? Well, it had only 320 when I was there, and my understanding is that most of the growth over the past 30 years has been in the security area, which is no surprise. And it had on the police force. Supreme Court has its own police force, and it has its own chief and its own deputy, and so on and so forth. And the building itself is affectionately called the Marble Palace. It's easy to see the Chief Justice as king and the other justices as members of the royal family. But I'd sometimes joke that my role was that of Hugh Capet, mayor of the palace. What I'd like to do now is to get more specific and tell you about each of these offices. There were 10 offices that I was to oversee, or oversee their officers, I should say. And the first one, and the one that has the most employees, is the Marshal's office. The Marshal is responsible for the maintenance and repair of the physical plant, as well as security. It's a big job. In addition to the police force that I mentioned, there are other officers and other offices in his bailiwick. There's the carpenter shop, the barber shop, the seamstress, the nurse's office, those who keep the building clean, affectionately called, excuse me, the char crew. And I suppose that goes back to the cold heat days, I don't know. There's a cafeteria, which is open to the public, and a motor pool. The court has its own fleet of cars, but only the Chief Justice gets driven back and forth to work. The others have to get there themselves. Justice O'Connor, she used to brag, she and her husband, they were quite well off. She used to brag they were a one-car family. And she'd bum a ride to work with one of the employees. It's the strangest thing. There's a crew called the Messengers. Get this. And they are, they're sort of like the Chief Justice's Band Fridays. And they sort of do, but back in the old days, before the court building was constructed, the justices did work from their houses in D.C. And these guys literally were messengers, and they ran messages from one to the other all over town. But like, you know, a lot of things in the federal government, it's hard to kill anything off. And these messengers now, they're just there, and they do whatever the Chief Justice wants them to do, or not Chief, but other justices too, go down and get you lunch or something like that. But the Chief Justice Rehnquist once told me, and it says everything about his own, this was a guy who was very hard-headed but soft-hearted, and he says, you know, I know these guys sneak off and play cards sometime, you know, and he said, but I'm not about to crack down on them. He says, they're paid so little, and where they're going in life, you know, let them be, let them be. Well, the man who held the marshal's position when I was there, his name was Al Wong. He had a previous career in the Secret Service, and his one of his details was Hubert Humphrey, when Humphrey was vice president. He then went to the White House and worked in the White House, and it was Al Wong, sort of let's say, a historic figure in his own right. He physically installed the Watergate tapes. Al was he loved to do things with his hands, and I asked him, I said, well, who told you to do this? He said, a name fondly familiar to all of us, John Ehrlichman. I said, did he ever tell you what it was all about? He said, you never asked Ehrlichman any questions. You just did what he told you to do. But the marshal, you'd see changing locks and so forth. Come on, it's the guy at the top of the heap. Why is he doing it? He just like to do it. His deputy marshal was also a former Secret Service agent, and he had Vice President Agnew as his detail. And he has a lot of stories too, which we don't have time to go into. Now the marshal also has this very public duty, which is to call the courtroom to order. It is the marshal who, boom, hammers a gavel and says, oyez, 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 all persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court. Boom! Have any of you seen the court in action? Anybody been to a Supreme Court argument? Okay, this brings back memories. My first visit to the Supreme Court actually was my first year of law school, semester break. It was 1972. And gosh, those days, it was January, and so, kids were back in school and stuff, but things hadn't really started. You could park, it was my first time ever to Washington, and you could park in the plaza by the Capitol, across the street. There's no security. I went in there to hear an argument, and the courtroom was half empty. And one thing I recalled, hey, in the back row, I'm able to spread out. I had my hand up there on the bench, and the policeman came around and swatted it down. Well, 15 years later, I was that guy's boss, or his boss. Watch who you swat. The clerk's office. Any of you lawyers ever argued before the Supreme Court? Whoa, John, I'm impressed. How often?
Once,
Whoa, and when was that?
April 29th, 1981.
Morning or afternoon?
Well, the thing is, after I was there for a while, I had, as you know, you get people, you get your friends sworn in as members of the Supreme Court Bar, and there's this little card you have to that you read, and as I say, I was there for about a year or so, and so I'm motioning one of my friends into the Supreme Court Bar, and I got up there, and I couldn't believe how nervous I got. I mean, that bench is not far away at all. And God bless you, man. I'm really impressed. That is tough. How'd the case turn out?
I lost 6-3.
Well, that doesn't matter, doesn't it? The clerk's office. Well, those of you who have had any business before the Supreme Court, that's the office that you're most familiar with, and it's the clerk of court, and it does essentially the same thing in any courthouse, and it's important stuff. It handles the paper flow and it's like the marshal's office, it's a very sizable staff. This office informs the parties how long their briefs can be. That's not their underwear. What color the covers are. What kind of font they use. This can be problematic as you double entendre. And when they are to show up, all sorts of procedural matters. During the arguments, they sit on the side of the bench opposite the marshal. So you look at the bench, and there's the marshal on your right, clerk on your left. In terms of ceremonial functions, the clerk and the marshal lead the Chief Justice down the Capitol steps for the presidential inaugurations. And until Lady Bird Johnson held the Bible for LBJ, that was customarily done by the clerk of the Supreme Court. The last clerk to do so, by the way, was the late James Browning in 1961 for John F. Kennedy. And Judge Browning later went on to become a judge in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. The librarian. Sometime after Justice Kennedy went on the court, he asked what was different about his work when he was a judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And he said that at the Supreme Court, he was confident he was getting all the law, quote unquote. And of course, the place where he gets that, other than the lawyer's briefs, is the Supreme Court Law Library, The Library of Congress also has its own law library, and sometimes it has stuff that the court's library does not, believe it or not. Any of you law school graduates go to Harvard Law School? Well, sorry, it's a good joke too. Congratulations, that's no easy thing. That is an impressive, their law library is an impressive place. I went back in my practice days, there was a book in the Harvard Law Library that neither the Supreme Court Law Library nor the Library of Congress Law Library had. Harvard Law School had it. And bear in mind, these are the days before the internet, before Lexis and Nexus and all that kind of stuff. So when we talk about library, we're talking about paper, books, pamphlets, that type of thing. The reporter of decisions. You lawyers are familiar with West and Amjur and all these other publishing houses that publish the court's decisions, but of course the Supreme Court has always published its own decisions, and those are the official reports. And the person responsible for this is called, not surprisingly, the reporter of decisions. He's the one to make sure that every jot and tittle, every comma and capitalization is exactly the way each justice wants it to be in his or her opinion or concurrence or dissent. I asked the reporter once, Frank Wagner at the time, if he ever felt like he was an expert on Supreme Court jurisprudence. He said he usually resembles next to nothing of all the cases that he reads in the course, and you can see why, because he's focused on other things. When I was working there, they had a docket, they had 150 cases a year. Now it's down to like 75, half. But it's still a lot. The non-statutory offices. The four positions I've just mentioned, the marshal, the clerk, the librarian, reporter of decisions, as well as the position I held, and I've mentioned this a couple times, were all authorized by Congress. And for you lawyers, they're in Title 28 of the United States Code. In case you want to challenge me. During Warren Burger's tenure, he created other offices, or rather, at least gave the court officer title to those who headed them. And these offices are the curator, the budget office, personnel office, data services, public information, and legal counsel. And I'll skip over most of these because they're not because there's not interesting things to say about them, but I think you probably want to hear about the stuff, the juicier stuff, when we get to the justices and gossip. The curator's office. The Supreme Court is not just a courthouse, it's also a museum. And the curator's office is the one that most members of the public encounter. They're responsible for the exhibits and the tours. The current exhibit, I don't know, I've been there since Christmas, so I don't know. The exhibit that was there when I was last there concerns the creation and construction of the Marble Palace itself back in the 1930s. It's very interesting. If you're into architecture, it's the thing to do, is to see that exhibit. And when I first visited the court back in 1972, I can recall it was on Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now, naturally, when you work there, your out-of-town friends, or even your in-town friends, they show up. And since you're supposed to be a big shot, you're supposed to organize private tours for them. And I did. We got a couple Alpha Chi's in here. I'll tell you later a story about our brother Bruce Hamilton, class of '69, affectionately called Bluto for the Popeye character, and a tour that I arranged for some of his friends. But the rest of you won't be interested. These tours actually struck me, both the private ones and the public ones are pretty good. But like all such tours, it depends on your tour guide. Has anyone here ever taken a tour of the Supreme Court? Oh, you have? What'd you think, Mike?
Thought it was okay.
Yeah, no. How about you, John?
It was very impressive.
Aha, that's what I want to hear. That's okay stuff.
Yes, really great.
And how long ago was this? 3:30. Mike, how long ago did you do it?
25 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah, about the time I was there. Still okay. How about you,
Still
John?
recently done that.
Aha. Ooh.
And the most impressive thing on mine when I was a kid was the spiral staircase.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. There's always. And it's an architectural wonder. Andy, you got your hand up?
Only problem is the tour guide I had.
Oh, you did? No, I didn't give it to her. Nice try. They also, the curator's office also organizes special events. And the most memorable one was my first full year there in 1987. And the United States Marshals were celebrating their 200th anniversary. Now the Marshals, I talk about the Supreme Court police, once the justices leave the Supreme Court, at least when they go out of town, the United States Marshals have responsibility for them, and for every federal judge, as a matter of fact. That has been their duty from the beginning, is to guard the judiciary. Well, on their 200th anniversary, they decided to make, and this was held in the court, they decided to make James R. Ness an honorary U.S. Marshal. Marshal Dillon, Marshal Dillon. And he was just overwhelmed by being in the court. And he was a big guy, you know, he's about 6'6" or so. And one thing, what happens with, you know, they used to call Ronald Reagan prune face, but I guess these, you know, these people who work under the lights, yeah, I just remember A, his size, and B, how wrinkled he was. But he was just astounded by just being there. And so were the justices by having him there. And it's like, wow, you know, Matt Dillon's here. And it's always fun to see famous people meeting famous people, because they act like you and I do when we meet famous people. But you know, it was a fun thing. The budget office, all safe, because we're almost halfway through before the questions. And same with personnel, but I'll talk about data services. That just goes to show how old things were. Who calls it data services these days? You know, and then that's what we call IT today. Public information, the press office, and finally legal counsel. These were the non-statutory offices. But I'll talk now about the non-case responsibilities of the Chief Justice, at least some of them, because I just think they're interesting. And certainly the most interesting was his role as Chancellor of the Board of Regents of the Smithsonian Institution. And that has got to be one of the most remarkable institutions on the face of the earth. I mean, it is a worldwide in scope. It's like a giant university without students, except the whole country is their student. Indeed, and they have, you know, things like telescopes in these remote Pacific islands and so forth. There's all these things that we're just barely aware of. And their board of directors are called the Regents, and again, by statute, the Chief Justice is the chairman of that board, and he's called the Chancellor. Now, they meet 3 times a week in the Smithsonian's headquarters, the castle. They have dinner the evening before at one of the many Smithsonian museums throughout the town.
3 times a week?
No, I'm sorry, a year.
Oh.
Oh, I'm sorry. Give me a shot of Coke, thank you. Smithsonian is both a private and a public organization. We think all the money comes from the feds, and that's not true. And Smithson himself, James Smithson, started out as just a private organization. But their regents also come from the public and private sectors. And some of these were household names, and deservedly so, because it's such interesting people. From the public sector, Daniel Patrick Moynihan from the Senate, Norman Mineta from the House, subsequently became Secretary of Transportation. Any Bay Staters? I know there are Bay Staters here in the audience. Silvio Conti from Massachusetts, at the time the token Republican in the Massachusetts delegation. Anybody have Boston College connections here of any sort? He always wears BC tie. He was, I never saw him without his Boston College tie. Those in the private sector were interesting, equally interesting and impressive. Chairman of the executive committee was David Atchison, the son of Dean Atchison. Bill Bowen, former president of Princeton, president at the time of the Carnegie Foundation. There was Anne Armstrong. Does that name ring a bell with anybody? And she, as you may recall, was a possible vice presidential pick for Gerald Ford. Poor Gerald Ford lacked the imagination and went with Bob Dole. I love Bob Dole, but you know, it's the most Republican state in the union. I mean, he wasn't going to bring Gerald Ford any more votes. And, you know, Anne Armstrong could have been the first because that was before Geraldine Ferraro. There was a fellow named Murray Gell-Mann. Murray Gell-Mann was a Nobel Prize winner in physics for his theoretical work on quarks, and who had, appropriately enough, a quirky girlfriend, which he brought to these brought to the dinners. And he got in trouble with the law later on too, and I can't remember exactly the details, but let's face it, whatever your problems may be in life, you win a Nobel Prize in physics. You're not stupid. There was Samuel Johnson, not the English 18th century writer. He was the head of Johnson & Johnson. There was also a James Dickey, not the author, and alas, no relative of John Sloan Dickey. The single most memorable project in my time there was the foundation, basically the Museum of the American Indian. And in one sense, it's a branch of something called the Hay Museum of the American Indian in New York City. Mr. Hay assembled in the course of his life the most extraordinary collection of American Indian artifacts one can imagine. From the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego. I mean, it was just phenomenal that one man could do this. And included some shrunken heads. And they looked sort of like, you know, the rubber shrunken heads you may recall in your high school days that your hot rodder friends would hang from their rearview mirror. Pretty good resemblance. The problem with the Hay Museum was in this obscure building in Spanish Harlem, Manhattan. I mean, nobody went there, except if you're some anthropologist or something or other, and some scholar. And something had to be done about it. And there was another problem, and that is he had a trust that it couldn't leave New York, and I can't recall if it was New York City or New York State. So the Smithsonian's legal counsel, you know, they do this all the time. They found a way, and the way they found was that some of the collection stays in New York, and most of the rest of it is in the Museum of the American Indian. And then they circulate and rotate and do all that kind of stuff. Something else that just began when I was there were beginning the discussions of the African American Museum, which, as you know, has just opened in the course of this past year. Any of you lawyers know what the Judicial Conference of the United States is? Oh, you do. I'm surprised. There's no reason why you should. Anyhow, it's sort of like the board of directors of the federal judiciary. And the Chief Justice is head of that also. It consists of chief judges of each of the circuit courts and some district court judges. They meet twice a year. They do most of their work, as all these organizations do, through committees. And in my subsequent career, years later, I worked for the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, and I was in charge of 4 of those committees, one of which was the Criminal Law Committee. And since we're all dropping names today, it's a big time to drop names. The chairman of that committee, and whom I got to know well, worked with her for 6 years, was a judge named Mary Ann Trump Berry. And I can assure you, she resembles not at all her baby brother in any way, sense, or form. I mean, she is the most refined, courteous. She would not say in private the types of things he says in public. And you just wonder how can these two be brother and sister. She obviously had no influence on his subsequent development as an adult in that regard. Federal Judicial Center will say that. Supreme Court Historical Society will say that for later. Supreme Court Fellows Program will say that for later, because you want to hear about the justices themselves. But as you can see, there's a lot of stuff on the Chief Justice's plate. But, you know, when people think of the Supreme Court, they don't really think of him in that capacity, because most people don't know any of this stuff. And so I'll talk about the justices. And everything the court does is done in the order of seniority. The Chief Justice, and then the most senior Associate Justice, on and on and on. So I'll do that in the same order. Start with Chief Justice Rehnquist, the late Chief Justice Rehnquist. There are only 3 still alive since my day, and only 1 still on the bench, Anthony Kennedy. When people ask what kind of person William Rehnquist was, I responded by saying, well, he writes his own speeches and he pumps his own gas. And he was just a totally unpretentious human being and extraordinarily considerate. The first instance, and it was a time that I first traveled with him. We were going out to Phoenix. And because he had this, what at the time was pretty notorious, this really bad back. And he used to, you know, there was this rumor that he was on painkillers and he was zoned out and this type of stuff. And that wasn't true, but what was true was because of his back, he would sometimes get up from the bench. He was very disciplined, and go behind the curtains and walk around, because he had to do that unless he'd get some sort of spasm. And the lawyers were advised, you know, hey, the Chief Justice is not walking out on your argument, you know, don't worry. But because of his bad back, he was entitled to fly first class. And we were going out to Arizona, and you know, I've been working for him only for a couple months, and he was, because he wanted to travel with me, he did want to go first class. I said, are you crazy? You know, you have to do this. And so finally, I said that was my first argument I won with the Chief Justice, was to convince him. But it goes to show the kind of what sort of guy he was. I mean, he was just amazing in that regard. The sort of common touch and extent of the importance of his own position, because would have extremely overqualified people applying for any number of positions. And they say, well, you know, I say, geez, why do they want to do these jobs? I say, well, you know, knucklehead, you know, it's not what they're doing, it's who they're doing it for. You know, that's the key, but he didn't quite understand that. He was surprisingly forthright. Once had a meeting with clerks who were not his own, who wanted something or wanted not to do something that he just really disagreed with, and he was really ticked off. And I'm in his chambers, and he just referred to him and said, hey, bunch of arrogant bastards. He said, and you know, I mean, you and I could say that, and it wouldn't make too much of it. But again, he did these things as Chief Justice that everybody would do, but because he was Chief Justice, it would strike me as just hilarious. Another instance of that, we're driving to Charlottesville for a conference. Mind you, this guy's 6 feet 1 inches tall. He drives his Volkswagen Rabbit. I couldn't figure that out.
From the back.
No wonder he has a bad.
That's why he had a bad ass. And the marshal is apoplectic, you know, because the marshal had to be responsible for his security and so forth. Now you got to take her. No. He says, I can relax when I'm driving. And that's where he stopped at the gas station. I know he pumped his own gas and didn't have enough money. I didn't give him. And I said, well, you know what? What do these people think? Chief Justice pumping his own gas is a bunch of surly clowns. And he says they don't know who I am, and if they did, they wouldn't care anyhow.
Noel, can I ask you a question here?
Certainly.
Yeah, thanks. When he had the road for the Chief Justice redesigned.
After my time. After my time.
Seemed to go cut against your no pretense.
Yeah. I don't know what that was about, and I never asked it. I never asked it. Now the rumor was, you know, he was a Gilbert and Sullivan fan, and apparently that's where he got the idea. I thought it was dumb, yeah.
Give us the
And
context.
if he were gonna do it, sorry.
Give us the context. What
But what was the change?
Oh, yeah, he had these, I'm sorry, he had the rows with these gold stripes on the sleeve, which was, I mean, Warren Burger sort of got ridiculed because he had a gold chain, you know, they put it in, and I don't know, it was, again, after my time. But if you were gonna do that, you know, if any of you've been in the court, you've been in the conference room, you see these portraits of the justices. John Jay, the very first Chief Justice. You know, in England, they wear red robes for the criminal part of it, and then black robes for the civil end of things. And John Jay had this really neat robe, which was red and black. And I thought that was, you know, if you were going to do something like that, you know. And he had his love of history, but he didn't ask my advice. I was already in the wings. I was out of that one. Well, another instance of his being just an ordinary guy and doing things that anybody here in the room would do and would make nothing of it. We're in Charlottesville at a red light. And the guy in front of him at the red light is just sort of sitting there. He's not doing anything. And so he lays on the horn, he shouts, "Come on, buddy, move it," you know. We would do that, so what? We've done, most patient drivers has done that, but it was just hilarious. He had a great sense of humor. He loved jokes, he loved riddles. And I have to tell you this story. Enough time has gone by. And this was during you recall Robert Bork, whose name is now in the Oxford English Dictionary, whose proper name, the noun, has become a verb, to get borked. He went down in flames. Douglas Ginsburg, you recall, the first nomination after him, found out he was smoking pot, not as a Harvard Law student, but as a Harvard Law professor. Appropriately enough, Bill Bennett, who was Reagan's Secretary of Education, subsequently became Bush 1's drug czar. He was the one who called Ginsburg and said, you gotta pull out. Well, anyhow, for half a year at least, almost since the spring, since Lewis Powell stepped down, Rehnquist is going, you know, with this eight-person court, and he's sort of on the point of, you know, just give me a warm body, you know. And so, sitting in his chamber, he says, you know, he said, I really hope this Kennedy gets it. I hope he goes through. He said, we just need somebody. And I said, you don't think this nudist call anything is going to... And he said, what? He gets up out of his chair, and I didn't expect this reaction, you know. And I said, joke. got this smile on his face. Years later, I told Justice Kennedy this, and Justice Kennedy said, I've got a better one for you. And he said, and this one's true. He, Justice Kennedy, walking down a street in San Francisco, sees a packet of letters, picks it up, looks at, you know, they all have the same return address and bound with a rubber band or something, looks around, that's just a couple doors down, goes in to return it. Obviously somebody dropped it on the way to the mailbox, whatever. Turns out the place is a bordello. And he's, oh my God, you know, this is all I need. I walk out of this place, there's going to be a reporter there, a photographer, you know, I'm doomed. Unfortunately, none of that happened. We'll move on to Justice Brennan. More stuff I could talk the rest of the time about Rehnquist, but we got others to go. And I didn't know these others all that well, but I had enough contact with them to you know, form some impressions. Justice Brennan was appointed by Eisenhower, and you know, there was this famous, whether it's true or not, no one can attest, but supposedly Eisenhower said his appointment of Earl Warren was the worst damn fool mistake he ever made, because Warren turned out to be this big liberal, and well, with respect to Justice Brennan, Eisenhower supposedly said, it's the second biggest damn fool mistake I ever made, because, Brennan turned out to be super liberal, but he was sort of like an Irish leprechaun. And he always had this twinkle in his eye, always this smile on his face. Just a wonderful guy. Byron White. Now, never say never, but it is highly unlikely that there'll be another Supreme Court justice who will have been a football All-American and a star NFL running back. It's unlikely this is going to happen. Byron White had these huge hands, and he had this vice-like handshake, and you got the impression he wasn't trying to, put it to you. It's just the way it was. He was just, and he looked like a former NFL star. He was really put together. And he was one of a couple, and he too had a good sense of humor. And he never sort of lost his sense of wonder and awe of the position that he held. And I can recall at the Bush 1's inauguration, he brought this camera with him, and he's sort of snapping all these pictures, God, look at all these famous people, he was a JFK appointment, very good friends with the Kennedy family. Carolyn came to the court his last day when he was on the bench. Thurgood Marshall, appointed by LBJ, Thurgood Marshall was the first African American to be appointed to the court, and quite probably the most famous lawyer of the 20th century, given all the civil rights cases that he handled and the history that he made and changed the country. I saw him frequently because he chose, unlike most of the rest of the justices, chose to eat his lunch in the cafeteria. So he was exposed to the public. And I was seated next to him in a couple more formal lunches in the justice's dining room. His wife, Cecilia Cece, was a Hawaiian, and she was and continues to be a frequent court visitor. His son, Goody, was the United States Marshal for the Eastern District of Virginia. And as someone who was sympathetic to the criminal defense, he was nonetheless proud that his son was in law enforcement. He could be, though, and it's a lesson to all of us. People start getting older, they start to get funny. And I don't mean ha-ha funny, he would talk about things at these lunches, but things he had no idea what he was talking about. But he would have this sense of authority about it. And then he could sort of be insulting in a Trumpian kind of way, actually. The University of Maryland Law School wanted to give him an honorary degree. And so, of course, when he applied, those were the days of segregation, so he was, just de jure, not admitted. And he refused, he stiffed him. I mean, he obviously wasn't Irish, but he knew how to hold a grudge. Another instance, when I left the court, he retired a year afterward, and he held a press conference, which I attended, and the first question a reporter asked was, sort of a typical, well, how do you feel? Yeah. And his response was, with my hands. Harry Blackman was someone else, I think, who stayed too long. He was appointed by Richard Nixon around the same time that Nixon appointed Warren Burger Chief Justice. And as you recall, or may recall, they were called the Minnesota Twins because they were both from Minnesota. But it wasn't until after I got there that there was another reason. They were the very best of friends, to the extent that they were the best men in each other's weddings. But before I got to the court, they had some sort of falling out. And I don't know what it was, never found out. And he mentioned that, he had been put in the doghouse, and I didn't ask what he meant by that. But even when Rehnquist took over and there was a change of regimes, he just seemed to be sort of haunted by that. I mean, he was just a pretty morose kind of guy. And again, people get to a certain age, they tend to lose their sense of restraint. And he would go out in these circuit conferences and he'd talk about how his fellow justices could write very well and so forth. And again, he was sort of a pre-Trumpian, I guess, and a man ahead of his time. Lewis Powell, he was also appointed by Nixon, and he was the quintessential Virginia gentleman. He was probably the most civilized human being I have ever met. And I don't think it was possible for him to be discourteous in any way. He was, for obvious reasons, very well liked. And when he decided to retire, he notified the Chief Justice first, but nobody else. And it was before he took the bench the last time, and they have their robing lockers right behind the bench. So they all suit up and shake each other's hands over. And he announced then to his fellow justices that he was going to retire, and Justice O'Connor just burst into tears. And they had to wait, they had to delay, the opening of the court so she could compose herself. It was an indication of how well he was liked. He was just an amazing guy for all sorts of reasons. I mean, he told me that after he was appointed to the bench, he had never been a judge before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. He and Rehnquist were appointed right around the same time. They were both in that category, never having served in that capacity. And Justice Powell told me that after he was appointed, he quit voting. It's supposed to be the apolitical branch, so he just stopped. The other thing he said which was fairly interesting. He said he had this high regard for Richard Nixon, not because he appointed him, but because he complied with the order to turn over the Watergate tapes. And he said, well, what if he took the Andrew Jackson route? He said, you wrote the writ, now you enforce it. What would you do? Have the Supreme Court police marching down, Pennsylvania Avenue, storming the White House gates? What would you do? So he said he hopes that Nixon is remembered well for that. Also, like Byron White, he never lost his sense of the position he was in and how rare and honorable it was. And you read all the time about how so many justices, or you see on TV, don't go to the State of the Union address, no matter who the president happens to be. A lot of them don't go. He told me, he says he always goes. He said, how many Americans have this kind of opportunity? A super guy. John Paul Stevens, appointed by Gerald Ford, well known for always wearing his bow tie. Whether he wore it to bed or not, I don't know, but I never saw him without it. And he was sort of the most ordinary guy of the justices. Whether this is sort of a stereotype of Midwest friendliness or he was just sort of this man on the street. If you happen to see him at some gathering or earlier, there's no way you'd guess he was a Supreme Court justice or anything he'd say that would indicate that. One conversation I had with him was this is with Pope John Paul II's first visit to the United States, and they met. Here's John Paul, here's John Paul. And the Pope's reaction to that was a sort of an amused reaction. And Justice Stevens says, well, this took place in the White House, and he said, were you there too? And I said, no, I saw it on TV. He was an avid tennis player, and he's quite fit in general. And unlike the colleagues I've mentioned, he knew when it was time to stop. He still visits the court occasionally, and he came to the swearing-in ceremony of Justice Gorsuch last year. Sandra Day O'Connor, appointed by Ronald Reagan, and as we all know, was the first woman appointed to the court. She and Rehnquist were Stanford Law School classmates. He graduated first in his class. She graduated third. They were good friends then, continued to be throughout their lives, and particularly the Arizona connection. As I mentioned, everything that justices do is by seniority. So it is the junior-most justice who, when they meet in conference to discuss cases, the junior-most justice is responsible for the coffee, the Danish, this type of thing. She loved telling this story. She said, here I am, the first woman to rise to the very pinnacle of the profession. What am I asked to do? Go get the coffee. She could tell that then it would be treated with humor, as you guys do, but you know, who knows now, you know? Justice O'Connor was the first justice since Roger Taney to live in the state of Maryland. How's that for trivia? You guys are Jeopardy fans, so it'll come up. Justice Scalia, another Reagan appointment, and one word to describe him would simply be ebullient. He simply radiated energy and brilliance, great humor, great emotion. And one reason everyone was so shocked when he so suddenly died is at age 80, he acted like he was still in his 50s. Just amazing. He was an only child, but he had 9 children of his own. I served on a board of a charitable organization with his wife, Maureen, who after 9 children looked as though she had just one. When asked how he managed a household of 9 children, his response was, his wife was the most organized human being on the planet Earth, and he takes care of the Constitution in their house, and she takes care of everything else. He was a lucky guy. My last conversation with him was at his last Supreme Court Christmas party. And we got into this debate, as usually happens when you're talking about anything, on the verses to the Christmas carol, Good King Wenceslas. And I can't recall what the phrase was, but I do recall that I was right. And that shortly after we were talking, we're into the conference room, the carols start, we get the little booklets out, and I showed my wife, I says, look here, I'm right. And I said, look, you're the textualist, Scalia, look, you're wrong. She said, no, don't do it. Justice Kennedy. I worked with him in making arrangements from his transition from Sacramento to Washington, D.C. And something there that's sort of poignant in that, you know, people don't realize that people make real sacrifices when they take jobs with the government. And his in particular, although he came from the federal bench, so it wasn't so much of a salary sacrifice, but he told me that he would have to give up his California homestead. It had been in his family for like 100 years. And apparently none of his children or relatives were either in a financial or geographical position to buy it. And even 30 years ago, Washington was a very expensive place to live, so he had to sell it. And I was very touched. Felt sorry for him. Well, guess what? Yeah, by skipping those non-statutory offices, I'm pretty close to what I'm supposed to be doing here. So I'll just conclude by saying that even though my time at the court was a little less than 3 years, I recognized it then, and I do now. I said, boy, this is the best job I've ever had, and I'll never have one like it again. So, not unlike the granite of New Hampshire, it would become part of me till death. And I am happy to have been able to share a little of that experience with you. So, your question.
There's an observation from a professor of mine, Victor McCusick. He was a professor of genetics in regard to Trump's sister. Dr. McCusick would say, I must remind you that infidelity is far more common than mutation.
Did everyone hear that?
No. On a more serious note, could you comment on cybersecurity?
Well, there was no such issue, 30 years ago. So it's an easy comment. It had nothing to do with it. I mean, there wasn't even email then. Cell phones, remember that?
But there isn't today. I mean, there's no sort of... Right. No, but the Supreme Court doesn't seem to have any way to process issues related to cybersecurity.
Supreme Court has never been in the vanguard of technology. It's appropriate, John, you know this, that as a souvenir from the lawyers who argue there, they give them quill pens. And it all fits in. It all fits in.
This
But in
is
terms
free.
of threat to the United States, that's far greater than even the military.
Well, I'm not sure about that. But, you know, that's, I mean, people in this room, their opinion is as good as mine. Yes, sir.
Did you ever play basketball on the court?
I did, and that is the highest court in the land. It is literally situated on top of the chamber, on top of the Supreme Court courtroom. They don't play while the court is in session.
Did you and the other poobahs you mentioned have to be confirmed or go through any kind of,
No, I
it was
was
just appointed by the court?
I was appointed, that's a good question, because I was appointed by the Chief Justice, and I was answerable only to him. As opposed to the other court officers where he forms a committee and they interview and so on and so forth. But I was so I always said he could fire me on his own without getting a majority of his colleagues.
So you're not civil service either?
You know, I never paid a whole lot of attention to that. But we follow those rules, and you raise a very good point. And that goes into the personnel thing that I omitted, in that it was chaotic. When Warren Burger was a very good administrator in terms of theory, in terms of the things he thought about. As practice, it was a mess. And one of the things that happened under the Rehnquist era when I was there is we sort of regularized the personnel system so that it more or less followed that of the executive branch. But no, it was not a civil service position. Yes, sir.
Noel, do you have any insider information on when the next vacancy might occur?
Jeez. If I knew that, I'd be like my friends at Pfeiffer staying the Hanover Inn for this, no. No, it'd be, I don't.
Hey, Noel, you mentioned earlier that extremely overqualified people, well, there are a bunch of them. How do you end up landing
I knew somebody was gonna ask that question. You know,
besides being a Dartmouth man?
well, that's very good, that's very good. You know, how did you get that job?
Yeah.
It's mostly, how did you get that job? and you know,
Do you ask that differently?
you Sam, you're a lot wittier than I remember you.
How did you get him?
Yes, and people ask that all the time, says, did you know him before? No. Are you from Arizona? No. How did you get that job? Saw an ad in the newspaper and I applied. And that's not far from the truth. I at the time, and that's how these were term positions. Rehnquist had been on the court for like 15 years before he became Chief Justice. So he knew where all the skeletons were buried and so forth. He knew everything. And the fellow who held the job for Warren Burger before I did sort of built his own empire. And Rehnquist did not want that to happen. So he made it a term position between 2 and 3 years. And I was the first of 6 that held that job. And when my turn came to leave, and subsequently published ads in the Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Times, Washington Post, it was done the old-fashioned way. And now, at the time I was the Deputy Director of the Association of American Law Schools. And one of the Supreme Court fellows, whom Rehnquist was asked to sort of stay over another semester to help him find the job that I eventually, or somebody in that position, he told me that he thought that an ideal candidate would be somebody like an associate law school dean, somebody who could take a leave of absence for a couple of years, come do the work and go back. It turns out that the fellow who succeeded me, Larry Averill, was dean of the dean of the University of Arkansas Law School, Little Rock. So that sort of model fit in there. But, yeah, it was just sort of hit and miss.
Do you, were you privy to the conversations that the justices had as they went through the decision-making?
No, I had nothing to do with the decision-making process.
You talked about the personality of each of the individual justices that you worked with. How did they get along with each other? Was there, how did they deal with each
You
other?
know, it's a a good question. There's a thing about the court saying that it's like 9 little law firms. And never did I ever see another justice sort of standing in the doorway chatting with the Chief Justice, you know, when I was there. And they, I don't know how they do it now, maybe they send each other emails. At the time, they would write memos to each other. And now that's kind of a general thing about how they conducted business. I was told there is a justice's dining room, and that is used in what was used at the time just for more formal occasions, when he would have members of Congress over who were on the budget committee or so forth. So I had lunch with John Noel. It was a thrill. He was on one of those committees. But it wasn't used what you would expect. My understanding is today it is, for the justices to come together. And my understanding today is that once a week they do get together. And the only rule they have is they can't talk about the law. But that wasn't the case when I was there. And I was told some of them just didn't like each other. But I don't know who was who. I don't know who that referred to. I didn't ask.
In the law library, is every state's laws also
Oh,
collected
gosh,
there?
yeah. Oh, yes, yeah.
So therefore, is it in the same building, or is there a different
It is in the
building?
same building. It is in the same
It
building.
all fits?
And a gorgeous place. Gorgeous place, yeah. Plus a whole floor. And the Supreme Court building's a big building, yeah. Now, again, all that has changed with electricity. You know, everybody gets. Freudian slip. That's how the board is, Andy.
I'll tell a story about Rehnquist and using his limousine for other justices.
Oh, jeez, Christ, did I tell you that? Well, only the Chief Justice could, as I mentioned, get driven back and forth to work. And the others did not. But one of the things that I had to deal with early on, they actually wanted to take the limo, they being the Congress, away from the chief. And so that was a real, you know, he on the one hand, you know, he was a pretty ordinary guy, but he had this sense of protecting his position. And we did a lot of research, and we found out, the deputy director of the Department of Apple Picking or something had a car that drove him back and forth to work, and the Chief Justice of the United States isn't getting one. And so, but yeah, we fought that one and we won. So he continued to be driven back and forth to work. The other justices, as I mentioned, they had to get themselves there. And he didn't particularly want them to be part of that action. Whoa!
Didn't he use it for some elderly justices that had trouble getting back and forth?
You know, not that I remember.
I've heard stories of them, though, picking up other justices during snowstorms.
Well, again, not my time there, and that may be true. One thing about snowstorms, he was sort of notorious for holding court on days when the rest of the federal government was shut down. And asked the press officer, and the answer was, well, hey, look, the guy grew up in Wisconsin, this is, for him, this is not a problem. But sometimes they don't make it, he did hold sessions where some of the justices couldn't get in.
Did you ever have anything to do with Ruth Bader Ginsburg
No, she was after my time.
after your term?
After my time.
The Supreme Court is the highest court. Now, you very briefly mentioned the administration aspect. That's a pretty huge piece of administration between the circuit courts and the district courts and all of that.
And
How does that get handled in this mix?
by the clerk's office,
Okay, but that takes
Oh,
the
yes.
clerk into a pretty, it's just like you say the marshal's office.
Right. No,
all of a sudden it,
Yes, yes, and
Hydras
and
on
it's-
you.
It's called granting cert, as you lawyers would know. And that is that in the federal court, you have an automatic right of appeal to the circuit court level. But from then on, you'll have petitions to the Supreme Court, and they just decide themselves which cases they're going to take. And that's called granting certiorari.
Question about justices' personalities and their clerks' personalities. And I wondered if you had observed any of this. It involves a story from the Brethren and 2 of the 4 guys in my class who clerked for Supreme Court justices. In the Brethren, it was reported that Rehnquist clerks were fairly informal, and they would all pack lunches to come to eat that day. And Berger's clerks were more formal and ate on fine china. And my buddy, who was a good old boy from Mississippi, who clerked for Rehnquist, said, at a much later reunion at law school, said, oh, of course it was true. And my buddy, who was a Cortland, South Carolinian, said, no, it's not true. And they got into this back and forth. And finally, the Cortland, South Carolinian who clerked with Berger said, well, it wasn't fine china.
Justice, I know nothing about that. Chief Justice Berger grew up in rather, not impoverished, but very humble circumstances. And one thing that I did notice about it, and that fits in, and I think he, as he advanced, he wanted to enjoy the things that he never could in his youth. And one thing I noticed about him, it's interesting that you raise that, because when he would eat in the cafeteria, and this was very delicate, because he just didn't know when to quit. When he stepped down, he became the chairman of the Bicentennial Commission. And he said, because nobody was doing anything to celebrate the bicentennial. And he retired justices if there were room, kept chambers and not their own, but they had their offices in the court. And but one thing so he was in the cafeteria from time to time. And one thing I noticed in doing is that if he'd get a cup of coffee in a styrofoam cup, he'd get a china cup, pour it in and drink from the china. So there may be some truth in that.
I remember you saying a retired justice still gets a clerk and
That's correct.
what do they do?
Well, sometimes they sit on courts of appeals. Each justice is assigned to a certain circuit. And
Even in retirement?
that's correct. Well, no, not necessarily. And they can do that even when they're on the bench. Rehnquist, because he wanted to do it, actually tried a case in the Eastern District of Virginia as a trial lawyer while he was a justice, not as Chief Justice. And turned out he was overruled on appeal. And they never accepted the case at his level. But they will frequently, and Justice Souter does this now, from the First Circuit, and he will go hear cases on the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and they're always, the circuits themselves are happy to have the additional help. And so they can, if they want, continue to do work. How often that happens, I don't know. Does that warrant a law firm's full-time tenure?
When you were listening and you were going through a number of positions in the court that you weren't going to discuss.
Yes.
I was intrigued by one of them, which is a legal counsel. So what does a legal counsel to the highest court do?
That's got an impressive title, too. You're the Supreme Court's lawyer. He handles arrests and demonstrations. People, you can demonstrate outside the building if you can't get onto the plaza. People do, they get arrested. He does that type of thing. He was very helpful to me. He was one of 2 people whom I did not discuss, the other being the personnel officer. They really served both of them as my right arm there. Because there are any number of issues, one of them personnel issues, and just gives advice. And Supreme Court has to do what's legal. And the last thing you want on the Washington coast is the Supreme Court decided to do something that was illegal. So he keeps them on track.
On that subject, was the council addressing
Recusal.
questions of recusal?
No, justices do that themselves, and they don't have to give any reason, and that's, you know, they can do just about anything they need, actually, they just don't. Unlike the federal judiciary as a whole, there's no code of conduct. You recall Scalia got in trouble because he went with Cheney on a dove hunting trip several years ago, yeah, they're free agents in all the rest of ways. Yeah.
Noel, Peter Fahey quoted John Snow about the Dartmouth Fellowship, there's no past. I sort of sense that in the Supreme Court, post-employment, there's clear connections.
Oh, yeah, well.
You mentioned you going to some of the events.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm sort of an official alumnus, and that's just great, because when there are swearing-ins, I'm invited to attend, and there were yeah, I mean, Christmas parties, I'm always invited, it's terrific.
But there's no card, you know, where you can always go back.
Yes.
Part of it.
Although I must say that as time goes by, there aren't a whole lot of people who know who I am. And Chief Justice Roberts, I mean, because he was Rehnquist's clerk, so he sort of knew who I was before he got the job, and he knows who I am. Justice Kennedy, of course, the others, no. I sort of introduced myself. The current holder of the position is a fellow named Jeff Veneer. When I introduce myself, I say, well, I'm Augustyn, and I was Chief Justice Rehnquist, Jeff Veneer. So it kicks in my generation.
Motion to adjourn.
Yes, granted. Did you like the slides? Did you like the slides? Oh, Aaron, thank you. We're on the freshman night, and we share our Christmas birthday, but you're 1 year older than I am. I'm so glad to see this.
Yeah, but you can't. You know,
Were you here for I climbed up to 35th and a lot different than when we did our freshman year. Oh, thank you.
You met before, because he was at Columbia. The Dartmouth.
Her husband had a spot where you.
Space